In this video, I show you step by step how to calibrate the E-steps of your 3D printer. The calibration works with any FDM 3D printer and should take no more than 10 minutes. The E-steps or extruder steps is a setting in the 3D printer's firmware that determines how many steps the extruder's stepper motor has to perform to extrude 1 mm of filament. If the value is too high, too much filament is extruded and vice versa. The E-steps calibration needs to be performed only once after assembling the 3D printer and after replacing the extruder or its components. You don't need many tools to calibrate the E-steps. The most important thing is a suitable measuring tool to measure the length of the extruded filament. The more accurate, the better. To mark the filament, some tape or a permanent marker is sufficient. Heat the hot end to the temperature you will use to print your filament. Load the filament normally as you would before printing. If your 3D printer has a direct drive extruder, mark the filament as far before the extruder as possible. The longer the distance, the more accurate the calibration. Also, pay attention to the maximum distance your measuring tool can measure. You can mark the filament either with a pen or with tape. In this example, I marked the filament 27 cm in front of the extruder. With the Bowden extruder, you can either do the same or remove the Bowden tube after the extruder and mark the filament directly after the extruder. With this 3D printer, for example, it is easier to mark the filament after the extruder and not before it. Now extrude a little less filament than your mark distance if you mark the filament before the extruder. If you mark the filament after the extruder, you can extrude the maximum length you can still measure with your tool. On my 3D printer with a direct drive extruder, I marked the filament 27 cm before the extruder and extruded 26 cm. With the Bowden extruder, I marked the filament right after the extruder and extruded 29 cm. Measure the actual extruded length. With a direct drive extruder, the remaining filament above the extruder is the marked length minus the actual extrusion length. With a Bowden extruder, you only need to measure the extruded length of the filament up to your mark. Write down the value as you will need it later to calculate the new E-steps. In my example, the 3D printer did not extrude 26 cm but 26.1 cm, which corresponds to a deviation of about 0.4%. At first, this sounds fairly small, but it can cause problems for parts where high dimensional accuracy is important. To adjust the E-steps, you need their current value. With some 3D printers, you can read and change them directly in the menu. However, on most of the 3D printers I have used, this was not the case. So the chance is pretty high that you need another way to read and change the values. To send G-code commands to a 3D printer and read out current settings, programs like Octoprint or RepetirHost are popular. However, if you don't want to use these by default to operate your 3D printer, there are other options that are faster and easier. There is an extension for the Chrome browser called G-code Sender. In order for you to use this extension to communicate with your 3D printer, you will need to connect it to your computer via cable. In the extension settings, you specify the port where you have connected the cable and set the baud rate to maximum. Now you can enter the command M501 in the control panel and send it to your 3D printer. The printer will then send you back its current settings. Under the settings you will also find the values for the stepper motors. On my 3D printer, the current value for the E-steps is 388. The new E-steps are calculated from the previous E-steps multiplied by the ratio of the theoretical extrusion length and the actual extrusion length. So for my 3D printer, this would result in 388 times 26 divided by 26.1, which equals to 386.51. If you have a 3D printer that allows you to change the E-steps in the menu, you can now enter the new value here. Otherwise, you have to send a specific G-code command to your 3D printer again. The command for this is M92 followed by E and the new value for the E-steps. After that, you have to save the new settings with the command M500. To my 3D printer, I sent the command M92 E386.51 and saved the value with M500. After that, I checked the new settings again with M501 to make sure that everything worked. As you saw in this video, the E-step calibration is done quickly. You can increase the precision of your 3D printer without much effort. I hope you enjoyed this video and I'm out.